He was told he inherited nothing but a forgotten patch of mountain dirt. What he found there wasn't a fortune, but a legacy that would force him to choose between $1 million and a promise. If you believe in second chances, make sure you're subscribed, because this is a story about finding home in the last place you'd ever look. When I left the orphanage, they told me I had nothing. That's not entirely true. They gave me a thin duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, and $112 in cash, painstakingly saved from odd jobs over 2 years. And they gave me an envelope, a brittle, yellowing manila envelope that felt as old and forgotten as the life I was supposed to have had. Inside, Ms. Albright, the facility director whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary disappointment, had explained, was a deed. A deed to a piece of land somewhere in the mountains, a place called Sparrow Creek. It was, she said, the only thing my grandfather had left. Her tone suggested it was less of an inheritance and more of a burden, a final piece of administrative clutter to be cleared from their books now that I was officially 18, officially an adult, officially no longer their problem. The air outside the iron gates of the Northwood State Children's Home was cold for a morning in May. It bit at the exposed skin on my face and hands, a sharp, unwelcome welcome to the rest of my life. For 16 years, those gates had been the boundary of my world. Everything I knew, every routine, every hollow friendship, every silent, lonely night, had existed inside that perimeter of brick and steel. Now, standing on the outside, looking in at the barred windows and the manicured, lifeless lawn, I felt a strange and terrifying emptiness. It wasn't the joyful release you see in movies. It was more like being pushed out of an airlock. The pressure of that place was gone. But now there was just nothing. A vacuum. I clutched the strap of my duffel bag, the cheap nylon digging into my shoulder. The $112 felt like a paper-thin shield against the world. The envelope, tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket, felt heavy, impossibly heavy, like it was weighted with all the questions I'd never been allowed to ask. My parents were a faded photograph, a story told in hushed, clinical tones. A car accident when I was 2. My grandfather, the man whose name was on the deed, was even less than that. He was a ghost, a name in a file. He'd been my guardian for a few months after the accident, and then one day he was gone. The state had stepped in. That was the official story. Abandonment. It was a word that had been branded onto my identity inside Northwood. Leo, the boy who was left. Twice. The bus station was a chaotic symphony of noise and desperation. People rushing, announcements crackling over a distorted PA system, the smell of diesel fumes and stale coffee. I bought a ticket to a town called Harmony, the closest stop I could find on a map to Sparrow Creek. It was a 7-hour ride that would take me from the sprawling, gray city into the heart of the Appalachian Range. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I watched the familiar bleak skyline of my childhood shrink until it was just a smudge against the horizon. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel happy. I felt numb, like a limb that had fallen asleep, pricked with the faint, unsettling promise of returning sensation. For the first few hours, I just stared out the window, watching the concrete give way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to rolling green hills that grew steeper and more rugged with every passing mile. The other passengers were ghosts to me, their conversations a low murmur that I didn't try to decipher. I was alone, truly and completely, for the first time in my life. At Northwood, you were never alone. You were always surrounded by other kids, by supervisors, by the constant, oppressive awareness of the system. The solitude on that bus was a physical presence. It sat in the seat next to me, vast and intimidating. Sometime in the afternoon, with the sun slanting through the grimy window, I pulled out the envelope. The paper was so dry it threatened to crumble at the edges. My name, Leo Vance, was written on the front in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Not the blocky, institutional print I was used to. Inside, the deed was a single, folded sheet of vellum, filled with archaic legal language and the looping signature of a county clerk from 40 years ago. It described, in metes and bounds, a 5-acre parcel of land. Taped to the corner of the deed was a key. It was an old skeleton key, made of heavy, tarnished brass. Felt ancient, like something from a storybook. Felt realer than anything else I was holding. Ms. Albright's voice echoed in my head. It's probably worthless, Leo. Unimproved land. Likely landlocked and overgrown. Don't get your hopes up, hopes. That was a laugh. Hope was a contraband emotion at Northwood. It was a weakness, an invitation for disappointment. I had learned early on to live without it. And yet, holding that key, feeling its weight in my palm, a tiny, dangerous spark flickered in the emptiness. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was curiosity. For the first time, I had a destination that wasn't chosen for me. A place that was, in some small, technical way, mine. The bus wheezed to a stop in Harmony late in the afternoon. It wasn't so much a town as a wide spot in the road with a gas station, a diner, and a general store. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth and something else. Something clean and wild that the city had scrubbed out of existence. I asked the driver, a man with a kind, tired face, how to get to Sparrow Creek. He squinted at me. Sparrow Creek ain't a place, son. It's a stream. Runs down off Blacktop Mountain. There's an old logging road that follows it up a ways. But nobody's lived up there in years. He pointed a thick finger up a steep, winding road that disappeared into a dense forest of oak and pine. That's your road. It's a good 5-mile walk to where the old cabins are. My heart sank. 5 miles. Uphill. But I nodded, thanked him, and slung my bag over my shoulder. The $112 wouldn't last long on motel rooms. Whatever was at the end of that road, it was my only option. The walk was grueling. The road was more of a rutted track, washed out in places, and the air grew thin as I climbed. The sun began to dip below the towering peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the rustle of unseen animals and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was a city kid, born and raised. This wilderness was as alien to me as the surface of the moon. Fear, cold and sharp, began to replace my numbness. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made me jump. It was nearly dark when I finally saw it. Through a break in the trees, a small clearing. And in the center of the clearing, a cabin. Dilapidated was too kind a word. It was a husk. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The porch tilted at a drunken angle, and a shutter hung from a single hinge, banging softly in the evening breeze. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching wilderness. Weeds and thorny vines grew up the sides, threatening to pull the whole structure back into the earth. This was it. This was my inheritance. A ruin. Ms. Albright had been right. It was worthless. A wave of despair so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I had walked all this way for this? For a pile of rotting wood? I sank down onto a moss-covered rock, the duffel bag falling beside me with a soft thud. The last of the light faded, and the forest became a wall of impenetrable black. I was 18 years old. I was utterly alone, and I was stranded on a forgotten mountain with nothing but a broken-down shack to my name. I buried my face in my hands, and for the first time since I was a small child, I cried. I cried for the parents I never knew, for the grandfather who had left me, for the 16 years I had lost inside those brick walls. I cried until there were no tears left, just a hollow, aching exhaustion. Eventually, the cold seeped through my thin jacket, forcing me to move. Shivering, I stumbled toward the cabin. The porch groaned under my weight, and I half expected it to collapse. I stood before the door, its wood warped and gray with age. My hand trembled as I pulled the brass key from my pocket. Felt foolish, trying a key on a door that looked like it would fall apart if you sneezed on it. But I slid it into the keyhole. It resisted. Then, with a grating screech, it turned. The lock clicked, a loud, definitive sound in the overwhelming silence. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing a darkness that was even deeper than the night outside. The air that billowed out was stale, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and time. I fumbled in my bag for the small, cheap flashlight I'd bought at a drugstore. The beam cut a weak yellow circle through the gloom. The cabin was a single room. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, its hearth filled with dead leaves and debris that had fallen down the chimney. A rickety table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, coated in a thick blanket of dust. In one corner was a simple bed frame, its mattress a lumpy, stained relic. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly chandeliers. It was a scene of complete and utter abandonment. It was perfect. It was a perfect reflection of how I felt. That night, I didn't even try to clean. I unrolled my thin blanket from the duffel bag and laid it on the dusty floor, as far from the decaying mattress as possible. I ate a stale granola bar, my last bit of food. I lay there in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a coyote. I was terrified, but underneath the fear, something else was stirring. A strange, stubborn resolve. This place was a wreck. It was nothing, and so was I. Maybe, just maybe, we could be nothing together. I had survived Northwood. I could survive this. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In the light of day, the cabin looked even worse. The floorboards were warped, and a damp stain spread across the ceiling beneath the sagging roof. But I could also see details I'd missed in the dark. A set of shelves on the wall holding a few cracked dishes. A rusty wood-burning stove tucked beside the fireplace. A tattered braid rug on the floor. It was a place where someone had lived. A real person, not an institution. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, fueled by a nervous energy I didn't know I possessed. I swept the floor with a broken branch, sending clouds of dust billowing out the open door. I tore down the cobwebs. I dragged the disgusting mattress outside, resolving to burn it later. The work was mindless, physical, and it kept the despair at bay. As I was sweeping near the hearth, the head of my makeshift broom struck a floorboard that gave a hollow thud, different from the others. I stopped, my heart suddenly beating faster. I knelt down and pushed on the board. It was loose. Prying it up with my fingers, I revealed a small, dark cavity in the earth beneath the floor. And nestled inside it was a small metal box, the kind people used for cash or important papers. It was locked. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I looked around the cabin, my eyes darting from one dusty corner to another. I found a rusty tire iron near the woodpile outside. It took several tries, the metal groaning in protest, but finally, with a loud crack, the lock broke. I lifted the lid. My breath caught in my throat. I had expected money, or maybe something valuable. But the box was filled with letters, tied together with a faded red ribbon. On top of the stack was a single, sealed envelope addressed to me. To Leo. And underneath the letters, a small, worn leather journal. My hands shook as I picked up the envelope. It was my grandfather's handwriting, the same spidery script from the outer envelope. I tore it open. The letter inside was dated just a few weeks after he had disappeared from my life. "My dearest Leo," it began. The words blurred as I read them. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come of age and found your way back to this place. There are no words to express the sorrow I feel for leaving you. Please do not think it was because I did not love you. I loved you more than my own life. It was because I loved you that I had to go. I had to make you disappear, too, for a while. I put you into the state's hands because I believed it was the one place they wouldn't think to look for you. A place where you could be anonymous and safe. Safe? I thought with a bitter laugh. Safe in Northwood. I made a terrible mistake, Leo. I saw something I shouldn't have, and I tried to do the right thing. Put us all in danger. Your parents. Their accident was no accident. I know that in my bones. And I knew they would come for you next. I had to run and I had to hide you. This land, this cabin, it was my escape. I hoped one day it could be yours. A place to start over. I have left you what little I could save. It is not enough, but it is a beginning. This land is more important than it looks. Do not sell it. No matter what they offer you, do not sell it. The answers you deserve, the truth of what happened to our family, it's all here. But you have to look deeper. The heart of this place is in the stone. Remember that, Leo. The heart is in the stone. Be brave. I am so proud of the man I know you will become. All my love, your grandfather, Thomas. I read the letter 3 times, the words sinking into me like rain into dry soil. A whirlwind of emotions tore through me. Grief hot and sharp. Anger at the injustice. At the years I'd spent feeling abandoned and worthless. But underneath it all, a powerful, surging wave of love for a man I couldn't remember. A man who had sacrificed everything for me. He hadn't abandoned me. He had hidden me. He had protected me. The entire narrative of my life, the story I had been told and had told myself, was a lie. My eyes fell on the journal. I opened it. It was filled with his handwriting, daily entries about fixing the cabin, foraging for food, his fears, his loneliness, his memories of my parents, his love for me. It was a record of his life in hiding. And then I saw the other letters in the box. They were addressed to my father. They were letters my grandfather had written but could never send. Page after page of a father's love for his son. I sat there on the dusty floor, the afternoon sun warming my back, and I read. I read until the cabin grew dark, until the words were just shapes on the page. I was no longer Leo the orphan. I was Leo, the grandson of Thomas Vance, a man who had been brave. And he had asked me to be brave too. The heart is in the stone. The words from his letter echoed in my mind for the next 2 days. I searched everywhere. I examined the stones in the clearing, the rocks that formed the foundation of the cabin. Nothing. I reread the letter over and over, searching for a hidden meaning. And then, as I was cleaning out the fireplace, my hand brushed against the large, soot-stained stones that formed the chimney's back wall. My grandfather had built this fireplace himself. The journal mentioned it. He'd written about choosing each stone from the creek bed, the heart of the place. My fingers traced the mortar lines, feeling the rough texture of the granite. One of the stones, low down behind where the wood stove would have sat, felt different. It was slightly loose. My heart began to pound. I pushed at it, but it wouldn't budge. It was heavy, set deep. I went outside and got the tire iron again. Using it as a lever, I wedged it into the seam and pulled. The mortar crumbled, and with a low groan, the stone shifted. I worked it back and forth, my muscles straining, until I could get my fingers around it. I pulled it free. Behind it was a dark, square cavity, much like the one under the floor, but bigger and lined with metal. Inside was another box. This one was a heavy-duty, military-style ammunition can, its lid sealed with a thick latch. Took all my strength to drag it out onto the floor. My hands were slick with sweat as I worked the latch. It sprang open with a loud metallic clang. I lifted the lid. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The top layer was bundles of cash. $100 bills, wrapped in paper bands. I counted one bundle. $10,000. There were at least 5 of them.
$52,000.
To me, it was an unimaginable fortune. It was a new life, a clean slate, an escape from everything. For a moment, I just stared at it, dizzy with the possibilities. But my grandfather's letter had said the answers were here. And underneath the cash, there was something else. A thick file of documents, held together with a binder clip. And more letters. This time, the letter on top was much longer, written on several pages of a legal pad. It was his full confession, his testament. My grandfather, Thomas Vance, had been a chemical engineer at a company called Omnichem. He wrote about his pride in his work, until he discovered they were cutting corners on waste disposal. Lethal, toxic waste. They were falsifying reports to the EPA and dumping barrels of it in an abandoned quarry on the edge of their property. He had gathered evidence. Internal memos, shipping manifests, his own soil and water sample data. He had confronted his boss, who had laughed at him. He had threatened to go public. That's when the threats started. Phone calls in the middle of the night. His car tires slashed. Then the accident. My parents had been driving home from a late movie when a truck with no license plates had run them off a winding country road. The police had called it a tragic accident. My grandfather knew better. He knew Omnichem had killed his son. And he knew they would come for me, the last of his bloodline, the only thing he had left. So he ran. He bought this remote land under a false name, built this cabin with his own 2 hands, and created a new identity. The money in the box was his life savings, every penny he had smuggled out for me. The documents were the proof. Memos signed by a vice president named Marcus Thorne. Lab results showing levels of arsenic and mercury that were hundreds of times the legal limit. And a hand-drawn map. It showed the Omnichem plant and adjacent to it, the quarry. And adjacent to the quarry was another piece of property. My property. My 5 acres. He hadn't just bought a place to hide. He had bought the one piece of land that could give him leverage, a strategic position overlooking the scene of the crime. He had a plan to expose them, but he had run out of time. A passage in his journal from his last year of life described a persistent cough and a growing weakness. The mountain air he'd hoped would save him couldn't cure a broken heart, or whatever sickness had taken root in his lungs. I spread the map out on the dusty table. The lines he had drawn, the notes he had scribbled in the margins, it was all a battle plan. A war he had never gotten to fight. And then I saw something that made the blood run cold in my veins. A small note at the bottom of the last page of his letter. Omnichem has a new real estate development subsidiary. They call it Ridgeview Development. They've been buying up land all over this region. If they ever come for this parcel, Leo, you will know their work is not finished. You will know the poison is still in the ground. Listen, if you've made it this far, you know this feeling. The moment you realize your whole life story might be a lie. The moment the ground beneath your feet just falls away. Have you ever been handed a key to your past, only to find it unlocks more questions than answers? It's a heavy thing to hold. For anyone who's ever felt lost, or like they're trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces, I want you to know this community is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're in this together. We're about to get back to the story, and things are about to get complicated. Now, let's get back to that cabin. I sat there for hours, the papers spread out before me like the pieces of a shattered life. My family's life. The $50,000 felt less like a gift now and more like a war chest. Everything had changed. The cabin wasn't a ruin. It was a fortress. The land wasn't worthless. It was evidence. And I wasn't an orphan anymore. I was a son and a grandson, the last soldier in a fight I had just discovered I was born into. The next few weeks were a blur. I took a portion of the money and walked the 5 miles back to Harmony. I bought supplies, non-perishable food, tools, a new sleeping bag, warm clothes, a solar-powered radio. I didn't want to use the money for anything else. Felt sacred. I worked on the cabin. I patched the roof with tar shingles. I replaced the broken window pane. I scrubbed the floors until the scent of pine cleaner replaced the smell of decay. I chopped wood and learned how to build a fire that would last through the night. I read my grandfather's journal every evening. His words a comforting presence in the immense solitude. I was learning not just how to survive, but how to live. I felt his spirit in the solid walls of the cabin, in the cool, clean water from the creek. For the first time, I felt like I was home. I explored every inch of my 5 acres. The land sloped down to Sparrow Creek on one side and rose to a rocky ridge on the other. From the top of that ridge, through a pair of cheap binoculars I'd bought, I could see it. The old quarry. It was fenced off with stark no trespassing signs. Even from a distance, the land around it looked sick. The trees were stunted, and patches of ground were bare and discolored. The poison was still there. My grandfather was right. One afternoon, about a month after my arrival, I heard it. The sound of an engine, a low growl that was completely alien to the natural symphony of the forest. I crept to the edge of the clearing and watched as a sleek, black SUV, impossibly clean for the muddy track, pulled to a stop. A man in a tailored suit and polished shoes stepped out. He looked completely out of place, an invasive species in my wilderness. He smoothed his tie, looked at my rustic, patched-up cabin with a look of faint disgust, and walked toward the porch. "Hello?" he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "My name is Mr. Davies. I'm with Ridgeview Development. My blood ran cold. Ridgeview, the name from my grandfather's letter. They had found me. I stepped out from behind the cabin, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to look calm, indifferent. He gave me a practiced, artificial smile. Ah, there you are. We were so pleased to see the ownership of this parcel finally clarified. It's been tied up in probate for years. He glanced around again. Look, I'll be direct. My company is acquiring land in this area for a luxury mountain resort. Gated community, golf course, the works. Your parcel here is, well, it's right in the middle of our planned phase 2. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer. I said nothing. I just stared at him, my grandfather's warnings screaming in my head. We've had the land appraised, of course, he continued, pulling a slim leather portfolio from under his arm. Given its remote location and lack of utilities, its market value is negligible. $10,000, maybe $15,000. However, because it is strategically important to our project, we are authorized to offer you $250,000. He said it like he was bestowing a great gift upon a peasant. $250,000. The number was staggering. Could buy me a new life anywhere in the world. But I knew what it really was. It was hush money. It was the price for my silence. The price for my family's memory. I must have had a strange look on my face, because his smile tightened. That's $250,000, son. For a shack and 5 acres of rocks and trees. I finally found my voice. It was hoarse, quiet. No. His smile vanished completely. He looked at me as if I were an insect. I don't think you understand. This is a life-changing amount of money for someone in your position. He gestured vaguely at my patched clothes, at the humble cabin. I understand perfectly, I said, my voice gaining strength. The answer is no. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes cold and assessing. He was recalculating. All right, let's not be hasty. I can see you have an attachment to this place. Let's talk real numbers. What's your price? Everyone has a price. He opened his portfolio. I am authorized, for a quick, clean, no-fuss sale, to go as high as $1 million. $1 million. The words hung in the air between us, shimmering with a terrible, seductive power. $1 million. It was not just a new life. It was a new universe. No more looking back. No more poverty. No more being the boy from Northwood. I could walk away from the ghosts, from the fight, from the danger. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper. I thought about the cold nights at the orphanage, the gnawing hunger, the constant feeling of being less than human. $1 million could erase all of that. Davies saw the flicker of conflict in my eyes. He pressed his advantage. $1 million, Mr. Vance. Transferred to an account of your choosing within 24 hours. You walk away from this ruin, and you never look back. Think about it. You owe this place nothing. You owe that name nothing. It's your chance to be free. He was wrong. I owed this place everything. I owed that name everything. I looked past him, at the sturdy cabin my grandfather had built, at the tall pines that stood like silent sentinels, at the ridge that held the secret of my family's murder. My grandfather hadn't left me 5 acres of dirt. He had left me a choice between a comfortable lie and a difficult truth, a choice between burying the past and fighting for it. I met his gaze. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. There is no price, I said, my voice steady. This land is not for sale. For a second, he looked genuinely shocked. Then his expression hardened into something ugly. You're making a mistake, kid. A very big mistake. We will get this land. One way or another. I'll give you 48 hours to reconsider my offer. I suggest you take it. He turned without another word, got back into his pristine SUV, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his expensive cologne hanging in the clean mountain air. The moment he was gone, my legs gave out and I sat down hard on the porch steps. The bravado evaporated, leaving me shaking. One way or another. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. Omnichem, the company that had murdered my parents, now knew exactly where I was. I was no longer hidden. I was a target. I went inside and pulled out the ammunition can. I looked at the money, then at the file of documents. My grandfather's last letter had mentioned one more thing, a name. If you ever need help, if you ever decide to fight, there is a lawyer in Harmony. An old man named Elias Abernathy. He was a friend of my father's. He's the only one I ever trusted. I don't know if he's still practicing, but if he is, show him this. He'll know what to do. The next morning, I put the file of documents in my duffel bag, along with a few $1,000s from the can, and I walked the 5 miles back into Harmony. The town looked different now. It wasn't just a random spot on a map. It was a place where my grandfather had a friend, a connection. Abernathy and Sons, attorneys at law, was a small, dusty office on the main street, above the general store. The sign was faded, the paint peeling. I walked up the creaking stairs and opened the door. The man sitting behind a massive oak desk was ancient. He had a shock of white hair, a face like a wrinkled road map, and eyes that were surprisingly sharp and intelligent behind thick spectacles. He looked up from a thick legal book. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Are you Mr. Abernathy? The one and only? What's the trouble, son?" My heart was pounding. I suddenly felt foolish, like a kid playing detective. "My name is Leo Vance. My grandfather was Thomas Vance. He told me. He wrote that I should come to you if I was in trouble." The old man's eyes widened slightly. He took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. "Thomas Vance. I haven't heard that name in almost 20 years. I thought he was dead." "He is," I said quietly. "But he left me this." I opened my bag and laid the file on his desk. He looked at the documents, then at me, then back at the documents. He picked up the first page, one of the internal memos. He read it, his expression unreadable. He picked up another, a lab report. He spent the next hour in complete silence, poring over every single page my grandfather had saved. He read the long letter detailing the whole story. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he was finally done, he stacked the papers neatly and looked at me. His sharp eyes seemed to see right through me, to the scared kid from the orphanage, to the lonely man in the cabin. "Ridgeview Development offered you $1 million for that land, didn't they?" he said. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. "And you said no." I said no. A slow smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Good. You're Thomas's grandson, all right. You've got his spine." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "This is dynamite, son. This is the kind of thing that can bring a company like Omnichem to its knees. But it's also the kind of thing that can get a young man killed. You understand the hornet's nest you're kicking?" "I think so," I said. "My parents." He said it wasn't an accident. Abernathy's smile faded. He looked grim. "No, son. It wasn't. We all knew it, but we couldn't prove it. Tom was devastated. He was terrified for you. When he vanished, we all just hoped he'd gotten away clean." He tapped the file with a gnarled finger. "This changes things. This is the proof he never had. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" The choice was clear in my mind, but I had to say it out loud to make it real. "I'm not going to run. I'm not going to sell. I want to finish what he started." Mr. Abernathy stared at me for a long time, his gaze steady. "All right, Leo Vance," he said at last. "Let's go to war." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mr. Abernathy was a force of nature. He made copies of everything. He contacted a journalist he trusted at a major state newspaper, a woman with a reputation for fearless investigative reporting. He reached out to a contact he had within the state's Environmental Protection Agency. We worked out of his dusty office, planning our strategy. Felt surreal. Just weeks ago, my biggest concern had been surviving the night. Now I was part of a conspiracy to expose a massive corporate cover-up. 2 days after my meeting with Mr. Davies, a formal notice was pinned to the door of my cabin. It was an eviction notice based on a bogus claim of a property line dispute filed by Ridgeview's lawyers. The threat was no longer veiled. They were coming for the land, and they were going to use the full force of their legal machinery to crush me. "It's a scare tactic," Mr. Abernathy assured me over the phone. "They want to bury you in paperwork and legal fees until you break. Don't worry, I'll handle it. You just stay put and stay safe." But I couldn't just sit there. That night, I took my binoculars and the hand-drawn map and I hiked to the ridge overlooking the quarry. Under the cover of darkness, I watched. For hours, there was nothing. Then, just before dawn, a large, unmarked truck rumbled up a service road and into the fenced-off area. Two men got out and, using a small crane on the back of the truck, began pulling rusted, leaking barrels out of a shallow pit and loading them onto the truck. They were removing the evidence. They knew something was coming. I scribbled down the truck's description, the time, everything I saw. The next day, we gave that information, along with the entire file, to the journalist Sarah Jenkins. The story broke 3 days later. It was front-page news. Poison in the mountains. Whistleblower's legacy exposes decades of illegal dumping by Omnichim. The article included excerpts from my grandfather's letters, scans of the memos, and the damning lab results. It told the story of my parents' suspicious death. Told my story. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The EPA launched a full-scale investigation, arriving at the quarry with federal warrants. The state attorney general's office opened a criminal inquiry into Omnichem and its executives, including Marcus Thorne, whose name was on the memos and who was now the CEO. Ridgeview Development's resort project was suspended indefinitely. Their stock plummeted. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and the hornets were swarming. It wasn't a clean, happy ending. It was the beginning of a long, ugly fight. Omnichem's lawyers countersued me for defamation. Their private investigators started digging into my past, trying to paint me as a disgruntled, unstable delinquent. The eviction notice was just the first of a flood of legal challenges. But I wasn't alone anymore. Mr. Abernathy fought every motion. The town of Harmony, which had once been wary of the quiet kid who'd moved into the old Vance cabin, rallied around me. The story of what Omnichem had done to their land, their water, their people resonated deeply. People would leave bags of groceries on my porch. The owner of the general store would wave away my money. I had found a community. I used the rest of my grandfather's money not for a new life, but to fund the legal battle and to truly make the cabin my home. I hired a local contractor to help me put on a new, solid roof. We installed a small solar panel system for electricity and a pump to bring clean water up from the creek. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a home, built not just with wood and stone, but with purpose. Months turned into a year. The legal battles dragged on, but the tide was turning. The EPA's investigation found overwhelming evidence of contamination, far worse than even my grandfather had suspected. A class action lawsuit was filed by the residents of Harmony. Marcus Thorne and 2 other executives were indicted. The company was bleeding money and credibility. They were losing. I never got $1 million. In fact, I was poorer than I had ever been. But standing on the porch of my cabin, looking out at the mountains that my grandfather had loved, I felt richer than I could have ever imagined. I had reclaimed my family's name. I had found justice for my parents. And I had discovered what home really meant. It wasn't a place you were given. It was a place you fought for. It wasn't about comfort. It was about connection. It was the foundation of truth you built your life on. The scars from Northwood, from the loneliness, they were still there. They always would be. But they were a part of my story, not the whole story. My grandfather hadn't just left me a piece of land. He had left me a legacy of courage and the chance to build a life that mattered. My grandfather taught me that some things aren't for sale. Your story, your truth, your home. They're priceless. What this whole journey taught me is that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the chance to make a stand for what's right. It's the strength you find when you fight for something bigger than yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for what you believe in, or for a place to call your own, I want to hear about it in the comments. This channel is a place for stories that matter, for people who have been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. Subscribe, And let's keep reminding each other that even when you start with what feels like nothing, you can build a life of incredible purpose. You are not alone in your fight.